we're super excited to invite two speakers with us here today. We have Professor Mary White from Boston University, who will first give a presentation on Japanese coffee culture. Then we'll have a food and beverage entrepreneur, Giuseppe Argentieri, who will talk about Italian coffee culture and will do a coffee demonstration for us. So I'd like to invite our first speaker up. Professor Mary White has studied at Harvard, completing a bachelor's in anthropology and Japanese studies, then a master's in comparative literature, and a PhD in sociology and Japanese studies. And before coming to teach at Boston University, she has taught in Kyoto, Japan, University of Hawaii, and at Harvard. She has conducted extensive research in a variety of Japanese social and cultural issues that range from family, women, and youth, to education, internationalization, and so much more. We are extremely excited and honored to have her speak with us today.
Thank you very much. The first thing I think I really need to say, want to say, is that this is a very difficult day. And for many of us, the idea of possibly talking about something as pleasurable as coffee might seem extraneous, but it isn't. We need it. And I know that especially at Wellesley, there are some very strong feelings of grief, and you need some consolation. So I hope we can at least give you a little distraction, if not real consolation. So thank you very much for including me. I guess I'm called a food anthropologist, and I just feel very lucky that I lasted in academics long enough to see food become important enough to have a field designated for it. So about 25 years ago, I started teaching food studies actually in Hawaii, which is a wonderful place to start teaching food, because it's this crossroads of all kinds of cuisines. But I quickly, I do most of my research in Japan, so everything about Japanese food intrigues me, as well as some things that people might not think of as archetypally Japanese, like coffee. So I'm a very involved coffee observer and consumer. And I'm very intrigued tonight to put together Italy and Japan in the same room, and of course around the topic of coffee. About 10 years ago, I think I got the best research grant that I've ever heard of, and I'm very lucky, from the Japanese Ministry of Education to study Japanese culinary tourism in Italy. And that was a 2-year grant. I mean, you can't do better. I moved around Italy with Japanese travelers, recounting their stories of finding their real home for the soul in Italy. They found the same emotional resonance in food in Italy as their own nostalgia for their own grandmother's cooking gave them. They kept saying, oh, la cucina della nonna. It's the same as ofukuro no aji. So they were making these equivalents that were, very profound and moving for them. So this deep cultural congruence. And at the time, and still, Japanese chefs are in the kitchens of well-known Italian restaurants. But for me, it is wonderful that Italian foods in Japan are so superior too. Though not so much Italian-style espresso, and that's a longer story. I should get to the coffee now. First of all, some of you know something about coffee in Japan. You probably have visited cafes or kisaten all over Japan. Japan is, to some people, a surprisingly intense coffee country. Japan is the third largest buyer of beans. Cafes are ubiquitous, as you will know, 3 or 4 per city block. And it's not a new phenomenon. In the 1500s, Portuguese missionaries came to Japan bearing coffee. They were followed by the Dutch in the 17th century, who also brought coffee. And much later there was a Brazilian connection, which we'll talk about. Coffee standards in Japan are very, very high. They're just in a slightly different cultural niche than coffee elsewhere. But that cultural niche of coffee in Japan has migrated, for example, to Boston, to New York, to San Francisco, so that Japanese style coffee making exists elsewhere, and London, by the way, too. What's happening is great innovation and localization of brewing methods in Japan, which is kind of really belies the idea that there is a Japanese coffee. It's actually very, very diverse. Japanese coffee people are becoming big players in origin enhancement, in going to work with farmers, in developing beans, working with agronomists to develop beans. But basically, I think I would say coffee in Japan is as indigenous as coffee in America. Now that sort of plays the game a little bit. Well, I go back with coffee in Japan a very long way. My first trip to Japan was in 1963. It was my first foreign country. It was my first airplane ride. It was my first everything. So it's hardly a wonder that I keep going back. The cafes were extraordinary. I don't want to give you too much detail of the ancient past, but cafes have always been places in Japan where a number of things, both novel and ordinary, can happen. Lots of new things and innovations came to cafes first. The way in the Taisho period, 1912 to 1926, you had a burgeoning of diverse cafes in which people would dress in certain ways and show off new styles of kimono patterns or new hairdos. When you wanted to show something new, you went to a cafe to show it off and to learn about those things. They were very political places. They were very social places. Music, different kinds of music came to cafes first. But now coffee itself came to Japan, as I said, as it was first becoming popular in Europe. It wasn't a big lag behind the rest of the non-producing coffee world. As coffee began to replace chocolate in Europe, coffee began to enter Japan as well. I'm sure you know some of the background that Holland was the great mover of coffee and other commodities to East Asia. So more than the Portuguese missionaries, the Jesuits who first brought coffee, it was the Dutch who really created a coffee boom in the Nagasaki area of Japan. Now the first Japanese people who learned to love coffee, not as a medicine. A lot of these new substances coming to Japan were first treated as medicinal substances. After all, coffee was bitter. It resembled Chinese medicine, so it was taken as a medicine. And you might be interested to know that one of the syndromes or problems that coffee was first used to alleviate was sleeplessness. Yeah, so it was taken to help you sleep. So, but the first people who enjoyed coffee as a beverage were the prostitutes of Nagasaki, whose clients, the Dutch, would give them gifts of coffee. The prostitutes found that if they sweetened it with honey, it was a delicious beverage and also would help them stay awake so that their customers wouldn't run off without leaving the money. So they found it functional as well, even though we just said that it was used to help you sleep. Contradiction is perfectly all right. At the same time that prostitutes were adjusting to coffee, shrines, local Shinto shrines, were receiving coffee as gifts from Japanese merchants who wanted to praise the gods and give the gods coffee as a way of supporting the shrines and also as a way of commemorating this new commodity. So they were the sellers of the beans, but they also presented it to the shrine so the priests could disseminate the idea of coffee as well. The very first coffee shop of note that really had an impact wasn't built until 1881. People were drinking coffee, but the idea of a place to drink it. There was a young man who was the son of a Chinese translator in the foreign ministry in Japan. And he was raised in Nagasaki, which is the port of entry of many things. And as a Chinese young man in Japan, his father thought he should be given something special to have a good career that was a little out of the ordinary. So he sent him to Yale University in the 1870s. And his name transliterated into Japanese was Teike. He was really taken by New York. He wasn't so fond of New Haven. So he would go into New York at the drop of a hat to go to big old coffee houses that were built on the English model, the London coffee house style in New York in the late 19th century. And he dissipated himself with coffee to the degree that he flunked out of Yale. That didn't work. His father had to be notified, and he was sent home via Europe. His father said, I'll give you this one chance, make something of yourself. Of course, he goes right to London and sits in coffee houses for months. Gets back to Japan, and he says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to open Japan's first coffee house. So he builds out this place. It's in Tokyo, well, it isn't there anymore, at Ueno Hirokoji. And it was called the Kahi Chakan. So you see, cha is in there, the word for tea. But kahi would be coffee. This place was like a London coffee house with big stuffed leather armchairs, newspapers on racks, writing desks, a counter where we would now call him a barman or a barista was making coffee. There were nap rooms and showers. There were things that Japan had never seen before. And so these merchant class people would come to the cafe and stay all day, using up all these amenities, kind of making themselves at home. A coffee shop owner now would call them campers. They stay too long, like without laptops. And he went broke because he was giving them everything they wanted, and they were spending 1 cent for a cup of coffee, which is a micro unit of a yen and very small amount of money even then. So he became despondent. His best friend found him on the edge of suicide and gave him a Japanese name and a passport and sent him to Seattle. And this is one of those wonderful stories you wish had the ending that led to Seattle's prominence as a coffee city today. However, he went into the coffee business, sold beans in a dry goods store, and once again made a failure of himself and died in Seattle. His grave at the Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle is visited by coffee industry people from Japan in a regular way. They have published a Japanese language brochure for people visiting that place. Anyway, I want to talk a minute about Brazil because it's really important. In the late 19th century, as Sao Paulo was gearing up the Brazilian coffee economy, they imported Japanese farmers, and there were big ships going out of Kobe. And by the turn of that century, there were many Japanese farmers working the coffee at fazendas or whatever in Brazil. And these people became entrepreneurs and brought coffee back to Japan after they worked out their contracts. And one of them, Mizuno Ryu, founded the world's first coffee chain, and that was the Cafés Paulista from Sao Paulo. So all over Japan, you have these cafes named Cafe Paulista, where the waiters dressed in Brazilian naval uniforms and were very smart, and there were flags. It was a very ethnically themed coffee. But coffee began to diversify. Japanese were getting coffee from all over the place by then. But by 1907, there was this represented the first wave, if you will, of Japanese sort of saturation with coffee shops. Well, I don't want to spend too long, but I do want to give you some slides and speak to them a little bit to talk about coffee today and the kinds of connoisseurship that have developed around coffee that you might want to say equate to the tea ceremony, but they're quite different actually. Tea and coffee are not actually overlapping beverages in Japan. That is, a person will go to this one coffee shop in Tokyo that I go to, and the first thing that happens, you sit down, you're given the wet towel, and you're given the cold glass of water, and you're given the coffee menu and a handleless cup of green tea. And that's a sign of hospitality. It doesn't replace the coffee. You're drinking the tea while you read the coffee menu. It's just to help you become part of the scene. So then you order your specialty coffee. There are ideas about coffee that are very elaborate. Coffee historians there are many in Japan. Coffee is a field of study. So what I think maybe the best thing to do now is to go on with the slides and fill in around what I've said. Delicious but not very fast. Well, it's not espresso. It doesn't happen fast. I don't know if you can see that. Siphon coffee came to Japan very early. The siphon seems to have emerged in France and Germany in the 1740s. But certainly the Dutch brought the siphon. Siphon is still a very common method of making coffee, especially in older kisaten, or coffee houses. It's definitely old school style, whereas in Boston you can find siphon coffee houses like, I think, Jaho, I'm not sure. But it's hard to see it's a Japanese painting of a Dutchman at Deshima in Nagasaki with his siphon on the table. And then the next is Japanese farmers working in the Brazilian coffee orchards. Thank you. That should do it. Oh, and this is the monument in Tokyo, in Ueno, to the first coffee shop, and that's the portrait of that sad young man who didn't end up very well, but who is remembered very highly as the father of Japanese kisaten and cafes. In the Taisho period, when a lot of new things were coming to Japan, especially women's hairstyles, these are Western hairstyles, they are first sported by the Japanese cafe waitresses of the period, the jokyu. At that point, cafes kind of bifurcated between these kind of cabaret-style cafes with women and sometimes music and sometimes alcohol, and what were called junkisa, or pure cafes, where nothing as distracting as a beautiful woman might appear. But coffee was the reason to go to these places, most often anyway. Students, of course, are equated with coffee in Japan as well as every other niche in the population. This is a cafe that still remains in Kyoto. It's called Shinchindo, and it was a pretty radical hangout for faculty and students even in the pre-war years, and when anti-war discussions among philosophic students and teachers were taking place. Now, one style of coffee house again, Taisho period, actually this is late Meiji, so it would be the early part of the 20th century. It was called red velvet because they were Viennese style, and red velvet, this is classic kind of cafe in Japan, and always the dominant drink there is cafe Wien, Viennese coffee. The styles of coffee houses are amazing. They're so diverse. This one, also in Kyoto, one reason that I spent a lot of time in Kyoto, besides the obvious reasons of, a wonderful place, is because Kyoto did not experience the heavy bombing during the war that Tokyo and other places did. It was a protected city. So a lot of the older cafes remain, and some continuously operating since the ancient times. This is a 1950s cafe, though. Siphon, that's a very old school siphon place where when you come in, one of these guys in the bow ties comes up to you and says, "What body do you like of your coffee? Koku. What density? How many grams per liquid ounce?" And you have to know things about your own taste profile. You have to understand that you're required to take part in this connoisseurship. But I mean, they're very nice. I say, "Oh, just make what you think I want," and that puts the burden on him. There are women who act as bar people. Not so much, they don't use the word barista, that's sort of Starbucks language for them. But she runs a cafe that is so meticulously maintained, and her focus on the coffee, which is called kodawari, the intensity of kind of passionate perfectionism, is such that when a customer comes in who isn't the one right in front of her, she will not call out "irashai," she will not welcome that customer, which is an egregious breach of manners in most places. But it's to show that she is dedicated only to your cup that she's making. There is some transfer between tea and coffee in some of these spaces. I don't know if anybody has been to Moon. It's on the top of a hill in Kyoto. And it's a very old tea house, but it has been transformed to coffee. And also, its style is pure Japanese design, but contemporary Japanese design. So they use utensils that reflect older or more traditional ways. Like this looks like a hashioki, or someplace to rest your chopsticks, but it's actually to rest the stirring utensil for your coffee. So, and the handleless cup for coffee is unusual. You usually have a handle. That reflects kind of an eliding the tea ceremony. And those are hand-blown glasses, so everything is perfect. Japanese styles have gone around the world to the point where Japanese coffee-making styles often aren't even labeled Japanese. They've assimilated. So in London, there are shops that have only Hario, Japanese equipment, and that do Japanese-style pour-overs. We'll talk about that in a minute. In New York, has anyone been to High Collar? It's a Taisho-style Japanese coffee house. They too serve coffee in handleless cups. There's High Collar. And the guy dresses in a sort of pseudo-Taisho elegant style. Have you been to Ogawa in Boston? Anybody?
Yes, we just took the group over on Saturday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Did you meet Haruna?
Yes.
Yeah. She's teaching this young guy how to do the correct pour over, spiral in, spiral out. And she is a master of latte art, which has only recently come to Japan because espresso only relatively recently came to Japan. One new thing in Japan that seems to be a pattern is that young couples, instead of, the older pattern was an older couple, maybe at the husband's retirement, would start a cafe or continue a cafe. But now it seems to be young couples launching their lives, starting cafes together. So I've gone to many such places. he only does pour-overs, and man, is he meticulous. So pour-over is an art of its own, and when you watch somebody doing a very careful pour-over, you're giving a lot of your time to that process, as is the person making it. Another older couple. Now, the fastidiousness, this guy pushes it to the max. He is kind of a hippie-style coffee guy who will only roast 25 hours before you are expected the beans that he knows he will use on that day. Because he believes, rightly or wrongly, that coffee beans start to die the moment they're roasted. So you must, and he gives it 8 days maximum, and then you throw them out. So you can keep green beans longer, but unroasted beans, providing they've been properly dried, fermented, and all that stuff. Anyway, he's kind of the extreme, and you have to watch him very carefully. Do you know about Bear Pond in Tokyo? Has anybody visited Bear Pond? Bear Pond is espresso handmade. One of the objections among coffee people in Japan 20 years ago to espresso was that there was a machine intervening between you and the coffee. That is, it should be handmade, tezukuri. But this guy, Tanaka, has opened this place in Tokyo, and actually 2 places, and he has a Marzocco, big espresso machine, but he has a whole lineup of little tools by the side of the machine. Between every shot that he draws, he takes apart the group head, he steam cleans all the parts, he checks the threading of the screws, and puts it all back together. So you've got 20 minutes at least between shots. So you got to be really patient. This is not espresso in the sense of fast. So, but that makes it his. That's the extra. It's very, very plain, unassuming, in a very remote neighborhood. And then he's only been able to draw maybe 20 shots. When that's done, he puts that sign up. The espresso hours are over. See you tomorrow. It might be 10 in the morning, but he's finished because he has been so physically involved with his machine that making it handmade that he can't do anymore. There are new, every time I go to Japan, and that means every 3 months or so, there are legions of new places, most of which have this kind of, the new ones have this hipster quality of, kind of leftovers and assemblage of interesting things. I don't know if anybody's been to Little Nap, it's quite wonderful. Oh, a feature of Japanese cafes is morning set, which is usually a meal that is offered to you maybe before 11 o'clock that comes with your coffee. It's almost like the coffee pays for the breakfast. And there's a variety, but this is kind of the standard one, which is that nice big thick toast and an egg and salad, a shredded salad. That is a sort of iconic Japanese cafe experience. Well, that's my slides. They cover far too much ground, as have I. One of the things about my experience of Italian coffee in Japan is that there certainly are, there's Segafredo, there's Illy, there's Lavazza, and there is a definite interest in Italy, above all. Everything Italian has it. There, affogato, the espresso over ice cream, is really popular, and especially for women. Women in coffee shops, especially if Starbucks in Japan has a very strong call for young women who are said to like what are called coffee desserts, which means a caramel macchiato or a sweetened dessert. So the affogato is very popular among young women as well. The uses of cafes are very different. I think Italians might stop by a cafe in Italy several times a day for a very quick cup of coffee. A Japanese person might stay for a much longer time depending on the functions that person needs the coffee house to serve. But one thing that seems prominent in both is this attention to the customer. That is, you're handing the customer something you have made. And that connection, in Japanese you would say omotenashi, or you would use the omoyari, the sensitivity to the other person, to characterize the relationship between the maker and the consumer of coffee. And I better stop there, I've gone over the time, I think. Yes, oh gosh, sorry. But I'm looking forward to hearing about Italian coffee house.
So now we will have Giuseppe Argentieri speak. Giuseppe was born and raised in Puglia in the southern part of Italy, actually the heel of Italy, called Salento. And almost 20 years ago, he came to the United States, where he began working as a distributor for Lavazza Coffee. Encouraged by his success, he moved to other areas in the United States until he settled in Boston in 2003. He now works at his own company, Silver Spoon, in Woburn, Massachusetts, selling coffee products and equipment such as espresso machines. In 2009, he bought an Italian dairy product company called the Mozzarella House, which is currently operating in Peabody, Massachusetts. It's a facility that produces various cheese products, including ricotta, scamorza, burrata, and stracciatella. In addition to having a retail shop on site, he also distributes to various stores and restaurants. And he's currently working on further expanding his business.
Do you think you can set up the espresso machine, or
Sure, yeah, you can do it.
is bolted? No. So Professor White makes my presentation totally irrelevant. So, very tough act to follow. But I'll try to add something else, if I may. And this is not part of the presentation, but I have to do it. Next time, I'll bring an assistant. So I want to do this first because it'll take a few minutes to warm up. I'm not here selling product, although I am mainly a salesman. So thank you for inviting me here. I don't do public speaking often. Actually, I don't do it at all. So please forgive my shortcomings. So Italian coffee culture. I would like to give a little bit of also add a little bit of historic background about where it started, and something about the plant itself, and then I'll get into the Italian way of drinking coffee. So now the name itself reveals its origin, which is an area called Kaffa. It's a province of Ethiopia, formerly Abyssinia. And there is from there it expanded in that area because it was the climate was more suitable for that plant. Here we go. So there is many ancient Arab stories about this mysterious black bitter beverage with stimulant properties. And one of these stories is actually represented in these pictures. Basically, they're saying that the coffee plant, the benefit of the coffee plant were discovered by goats rather than people, because they were chewing on the fruit off of the plant. The plant is this one, and these goats were particularly active. So the man started picking and tried to make something of it. So this black bitter beverage that had its qualities, and it was used as a medicinal supplement. It reached the west, through the Dutch, as mentioned before, around 1600, when they interrupted the Arab monopoly on coffee production. And when the Dutch landed on the coast of Mocha in Yemen, seized a few coffee plants. Back then, coffee plants were in the way to plant it and grow it, were guarded the same way industrial secrets are guarded nowadays, because it was a way of living. So some plants were seized and transported in some Dutch or French colonies where they had the most favorable climate for growing it. It was so important that these coffee plantations were becoming so important at the time that Brazil, having the most favorable climate, also got interested. But since the French and the Dutch were keeping a stronghold on these plantations, they came up with a trick that I enjoy telling the story because it's special. They secured a meeting with the French colony with the excuse of setting up settling some border disputes. So in this meeting, this lieutenant from Brazil was asking the French diplomat if they could take some of these wonderful fruits off of the plants that they had in the garden. Well, politely, the diplomat politely refused because it was something that they wanted to keep to themselves as much as possible. So this lieutenant, apparently good-looking lieutenant, tried another way, tried to seduce the wife of this Frenchman, and the wife agreed to give some of these fruits. So, well, Brazil now is the #1 producer of coffee, thanks to this lieutenant. So, let's go to that's Brazil, world's largest producer. Now the plant itself, as you can see, it's bright green. It grows very tall, but it's typically pruned to be about 10 feet tall at the most for ease of working with it. So for picking. So this is the fruit itself. Obviously, it starts with a flower, and then there is the green fruit, and then when it's ripe, it becomes red or yellow. The plant is part of the Rubiaceae family. There are many species, but only 2 are relevant for commercial use, and they are Arabica and Robusta, which is 2 names very familiar for coffee drinkers. It's an evergreen, and the harvesting can happen in a couple of different ways. The hand picking, which can give you a product that is bit more uniform because it will pick only the fruit that is perfectly ripe, or mechanically, and it's called stripping because there is that machine that surrounds the tree and strips all the coffee fruits off the plant. So we are at the processing. The processing is a couple of different ways, the wet or dry. Basically these fruits are laid on the ground and dried, or submerged in water until the pulp around the seed comes off. So at this point, I'm sure many of you have seen coffee before, but I brought a sample of green coffee. So for if there is someone that has never seen a green coffee, I have some here. I don't know if you want to pass it around. There is and the coffee is slightly different shape, whether if it's the Arabic or the Robusta. One is round, more round. The other one is long, but it's extremely similar. Now, what happens to the green coffee next is the roasting. So roasting happens in, this is what's represented here. It's a very small machine that basically the green coffee goes around a very hot surface. It can go from, it goes from 50 degrees Celsius to about 200 to 230, according to the degree of roasting that you're looking for. So once the bean itself is roasted, it goes into that lower drum where it gets cooled, because the cooling is just as important. So what happens to the bean, you can see in this chart, in this photo, it goes from green to various degrees of brown. And so when it's brown, it can be from light to dark according to what we're trying to achieve. It's really, the roasting is the part that brings out the aroma of the bean itself. So it's the most important part of the process. And probably it's a process that was used, I think, by accident. Probably just like the discovery. Someone roasted that fruit and they noticed that it brought up a whole series of aroma. The last thing I want to say about the bean itself is that with the roasting process, it changes. Its characteristic change. The weight goes down because of it loses the humidity, and the size grows, becomes bigger. Yeah, I think that's it with roasting. So the espresso, which is the way we make coffee in Italy. Well, the commercial way we make coffee in Italy, because we use also a cafetiera, which is a stovetop coffee maker, which basically gets boiled water going through a filter, and the coffee comes out in the top part. So this method has been in every single household in Italy for the past 150 years, probably. And it is still in most homes. I mean, there is no homes without one of these little stovetop. What you find commercially in a coffee shop, we call it bar, but bar here is associated to alcohol. In Italy, not really. A bar in Italy is a place where you can go and have espresso. Sometimes you can have also alcohol. So there is a use of those commercial machines. So to make an espresso, we need to respect a few characteristics. So we need 7 grams of coffee. We need about 40 ml of hot water. Water should be at 90 degrees. and the extraction should take about 20 to 25 seconds. So at the end of this process, you get that beverage that's about 25 to 30 ml, because the rest of the water is kept in the coffee. So this very invigorating beverage is, as you can see, being so short, it doesn't take a lot to drink. Most of the time in Italy is consumed standing up, and hence this picture that has well, the first picture represents an old situation in which perhaps the time allowed to sit down and chit-chat and talk about politics or other things among people. The coffee shop was a beautifully uniting experience because it would unite the people of all culture and financial position. And even the server was allowed to chime in a discussion after asking permission. So I find a very democratic beverage. This is a picture of Café Florian, which is one of the most historic coffee shops in Venice. Oh, True Christian Drink, I'll tell you why, because that's a very fascinating story. Because when coffee arrived to Italy in Venice, the story is that there was this physician from Padua. He was the physician of a diplomat in Egypt. And in Egypt they were using this beverage already, so he took some of the beans with him back to Italy to get some interest. He got interest immediately, and therefore they started bringing in coffee. And back then, in the 17th century, there was a lot of movement of merchandise in the Mediterranean. So it caught on immediately. They started opening the first coffee shops. I think the first is 1683. The first Bottega del Café, which was in Venice. This is a little bit later, but you get the idea. They were very beautiful places, very elegant. This has been the same, as probably the walls will tell you. It's been the same for a long time. Now, True Christian Drink, because when this coffee, the beverage itself, started becoming popular throughout Italy, church was a little bit worried because this dark, bitter, invigorating beverage, put priest a little bit at unease. So when the Pope was called to give an opinion, he said, he wanted to try it first. He said, let me see if it's really the beverage of Satan. He found it so good that he said, no, it's better to fight Satan by blessing the beverage. So we bless it, and then from then on, it just got on in the rest of Italy and became an extremely popular from north to south. And currently, it's enjoyed everywhere in Italy with slight differences. And it's the roasting of coffee is a regional phenomenon. Although there is a few brands, just like Lavazza, for example, that made it nationwide because they took advantage of a TV commercial. They were one of the first brands to invest in a TV commercial. It still remains a local flavor, a local taste. So they roast in southern Italy in a different way than they roast in northern Italy. So one of my favorite pictures of Italians having coffee. So this, so that's the way we still enjoy it. So even though the picture may be very old, it's these two actors are representing a moment of Italian life. So we typically go to a coffee shop with someone else. every time that, especially in a small town lifestyle, every time you see someone you invite, regardless whether if you had an espresso 5 minutes before. You just invite, you want a coffee. Would you like a cafe? It's done. Even if you don't take one, you invite someone else to do it. There is a few other things that happen when having an espresso. For example, in southern Italy, there is if you're in this situation and someone walks in that you're supposed to pay for his espresso and whoever is with him. So you're supposed, since you're buying your own coffee first, you get to the register to pay for it sooner. So you pay for yours and also theirs. Now, if you don't do it, nobody gets like really offended. But it's a nice public acknowledgement that people really enjoy. If you know someone, you walk in, you know someone that it's a way to pay your respect, and so I think it's still felt, especially in southern Italy. While I was telling the story, I forgot to give you the roasted beans already, but I think you've seen those before, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're much more popular than the green beans. A variation of this courtesy is the caffè sospeso, the concept of paying coffee for someone else that you don't know. Unlike when someone else walks into the coffee shop and you do the courtesy of paying for it. You pay for another espresso to someone that can't afford it, or to someone that is going to come right after you. So this type of concept originates in Naples. It's more than 100 years old, but it was renewed around 2008, 2009 after the financial crisis and the constant crisis that we have in Italy. So it's an excellent concept. It's because it's very inclusive. So what happens is it gives the chance to someone that doesn't have the money, even though it's a very small amount of money, but someone that doesn't have the means can walk into a bar that typically has a sticker on the door. It's a very subtle sticker that gives you confidence to go and ask for it. You go ask for, is there any sospeso? Or you don't even ask. Sometimes they have a sign somewhere and there is a number, and those are the number of sospeso available. So you walk in, you use that sospeso, they cross it off and they update the number. So that's coffee in Italy. So to end this my coffee story in Italy, I want to say that coffee is it's used in every moment. Can be good or can be bad. Can be used before a business meeting, or it can be used when right before delivering bad news. Because I think because due to the properties of the coffee and the symbolism, nobody will ever say no to it. And if you guys have any questions, please ask. I am done. There's nothing else to add. Thank you for listening.
So if people do have questions for either of our speakers, then we have several minutes. So, any questions, anyone?
I have a couple questions for Professor White. You talked about how some of these coffee makers are very, very particular and fastidious about the way they make coffee, especially the guy who makes espresso by hand. And I'm wondering if you've ever seen it or heard of somebody who roasts their beans without any kind of mechanical aid, actually, like just fire. Okay, so that happens quite a bit.
And there's these little, they look like old-fashioned popcorn poppers that you would use when you're going camping or something, with a screen on the top. so that beans won't pop out.
So this is an open flame that they're using?
Oh, you mean, yeah,
Yeah, okay,
oh, just in a pan.
okay.
Yeah, you have to have something.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
No, I
yeah.
was thinking like some of these guys might have, like be building fires
The
and.
first time, yeah. Throwing them fun.
Yeah.
The first time I saw people, roasting beans on the street, I helped to start a coffee cooperative in Cambodia. And people roast the beans on the street with a little oil over a piece of wood. I mean, it's really, really basic. The problem, of course, is control,
Right.
and that's control of the heat, the timing, everything. So one should not have too refined a palate if you're roasting your own beans in such a manner. You should really just be happy you're doing it. I've given up roasting. I mean, for a while I tried roasting at home, but it's such a specialized skill. I mean, there are too many variables. So I go to the masters. I was going to ask you a question about roasting.
Yes.
What roasts levels are preferred for espresso?
A darker roast.
All the way past French, past the darkest?
It depends on the region. For example, in southern Italy they like a darker roast, in northern Italy they use a lighter roast. In northern Italy they use a less percentage of Robusta to Arabica. While in southern Italy it's more. The Arabica gives more of the chocolatey flavor than the Arabica. So it's the same rule does not apply all over Italy, but it's on the darker side. One thing that I want to add about roasting is about the coffee world really. It's one of those fields in which technology helps. I mean, large scale really helps with the quality of coffee because there is, being a natural product, every bean is different. So having equipment that can select each bean by size, humidity, color, it's a marvel that can be obtained only with equipment, huge equipment, very costly. And I know it's not as romantic as the guy roasting his own beans, but I think the result is better when the beans are handled by a big roasting company.
So when you talk about the differences between roasting in the north and the south, you mean in local bars, cafes? Because in the supermarket you will find the same, I suppose, right? From north to south. Type of coffee like Lavazza doesn't change. Or it sends to various...
No, Lavazza doesn't change.
Okay.
Right. So name brands that are distributed all over Italy are the same. But then in the same aisle, coffee aisle, you'll find the regional brand.
Okay.
And the regional brand of Puglia is different than the regional brand in Piedmont.
This is a question for both speakers. So both of you guys mentioned how coffee would go from medicinal to a normally consumed product. What cultural forces do you think really promoted that change? Because it does taste pretty bitter, so why do people treat it like a...
I'm afraid I didn't hear your question very well.
Oh, I was just wondering, what are the cultural factors that promote the change from seeing coffee as a kind of medicine towards like coffee being a very casual beverage?
Well, first of all, there had to be a critical mass of people drinking it. There had to be enough beans available, and it had to cross over from an imported thing to a naturalized local thing, and that took time. And it also, by the late 19th century, there was a lot more Western influence in Japan. So Western ways of drinking coffee kind of superseded the earlier Japanese ways of drinking, which, so I think, you can't point to a specific moment or historical incident or anything. Yeah, now it's kind of like breathing. I mean, there's nothing seen as exotic or foreign about it at all. And there's so many ways of drinking coffee. I mean, from kind of pedestrian, like the canned coffee you get out of the vending machine. I mean, the same person early in the morning might have a cup of crappy instant coffee at home and go on his way to a really great cafe, but stop and get a vending machine canned coffee, so, and then get to this incredible specialty coffee at the cafe. No problem. There's, you know, you just have coffee many different ways in the same day.
Maybe one more question?
No one else? I have a question for Giuseppe. I would like to know if you agree that the best coffee in Italy is served in Naples, and if yes, if you also agree with an explanation that I often heard in Italy, it's because of the type of water that they use in Naples. So if you also think that water has an impact on the quality, we talked about roasting and whatever water.
I personally like the Neapolitan style because it's a shorter shot. So when it's during the extraction of the espresso, all the oils are at the beginning of the extraction. So the best part that you can get is in the very first few drops of that espresso. So yes, it has a better flavor, but because you're getting just the beginning, just the heart of those coffee grounds. The rest of it is taking out. The rest of the water going through the coffee ground is extracting caffeine. So if you want a lot of flavor, you should have it as short as possible. So in northern Italy, it's longer, almost double the size that in Naples. The water, it may have something to do with it, but typically espresso machines have filtration systems ahead to sort of stabilize the levels. You know, so it should be similar to water. Yeah.
Are you still want to do that?
All right, I'll do an espresso, sure. So this is, they simplified the way to make an espresso. So this machine replicates what happens into one of those bigger, the professional machines that we saw earlier. So about 7 grams of coffee in a system that replicates time, temperature, and pressure. So it's a lot more convenient, a lot easier. Now, these type of machines allow to throw away, the little stove top. You saw in that picture, the dirt is gone. So you can have espresso now in your office or in your home. So I don't travel with this. I brought it tonight. But I do have one at home and one at the office. And not just because I'm in the business. I mean, my father has one at home too. So whoever wants to, please. Yeah. And that's not to look at, you can drink it. There's plenty for everyone. So even the aroma that comes out of the machine is already invigorating.
So can we give one last round of applause to both of our speakers? And we'll be passing around the coffee. There's still more desserts. Also, Wellesley students, please sign in. There's a laptop right outside of the right door. Thank you.